We live in an increasingly divided world where our political parties, religious convictions, and personal identities are used to polarize and pit us against one another. As the ancient prophets wrote, a house divided cannot stand. This division is literally tearing our world apart. The only path to create true and lasting healing in our world is to come together with civility, respect, and honesty, sharing our stories and discussing our perspectives across our deepest divides. Welcome to the Patchwork Podcast with author, pastor, and activist Brandon Robertson. In every episode, we seek to cultivate compelling conversations to help bring clarity and understanding to some of the most controversial topics of our day, with the hope of bridging our collective divides one conversation at a time. So thank you for joining us on this journey together. Let's listen to this week's conversation.
Well, welcome to the Patchwork Podcast. It's Brandon Robertson here. One of my geeky interests is that I love politics. But beyond politics, I love the executive branch. And beyond the executive branch, I love the White House. A couple years ago, I had the opportunity to work in Washington, D.C., and I got to work a lot with people within the Obama administration. And so I had a number of meetings over the course of my 2.5 years working in DC where I actually got to go to the White House and speak at the White House once on the federal summit against bullying that President Obama hosted, and also just to meet with different officials in the White House about different policies and projects that President Obama was working on. And every time I passed through those gates, my fascination and wonderment about this place, which is a rather small house, and yet it's the most powerful building on earth. Within the 4 gates that surround the White House, there is policies and discussions and ideas that will shape the trajectory of humanity. And yet there are thousands of regular people who work in the White House and who engage in these discussions every day as a normal activity. And that to me is kind of mind-blowing and enamoring. And so today I'm kind of taking a different direction on the Patchwork Podcast. Instead of talking about the things that divide us and the polarizing issues of our day, I wanted to indulge a bit and talk to an author that I greatly admire named Kate Andersen-Brower. Kate Andersen-Brower is an American journalist and author who has written 3 books about the White House, 2 of which have been New York Times bestsellers. The books are The Residence, Inside the Private World of the White House, First Women, the Grace and Power of America's Modern First Ladies, and her most recent book, First in Line, Presidents, Vice Presidents, and the Pursuit of Power. She covered the White House for Bloomberg News during President Barack Obama's first term, and before that she worked for CBS News and Fox News as a producer. She's a CNN contributor and has written for the New York Times, Vanity Fair, the Washington Post, and the Smithsonian. And I've loved her books, particularly her book, First Women, and her book, First in Line, were 2 of my favorite books because they gave insight into kind of the private life of the president. So you hear a bit about the president and the relationship he has had with his wife, the First Lady, and the power that First Ladies have wielded in the White House and been able to influence significant world events and policies. And then First in Line talks about the often contentious relationship that we perceive between the president and the vice president. And Kate has done a lot of work interviewing staff members of the White House, but also I believe she's interviewed every living president and has gotten just a wealth of insight and knowledge. And so in this interview, I talked to her about the First Lady, and the role of the First Lady in modern history. I talked to her about the possibility of a first gentleman and what that could look like. We talk about the relationship between Barack Obama and Joe Biden, and also the relationship between President Trump and Mike Pence, our vice president. And so it's just a fascinating conversation, and I hope you get as jazzed about it as I do. Kate's an incredible reporter with some incredible insights, and so I hope you enjoy our conversation. So without further ado, here's my interview with Kate Andersen-Brower about her books, The Residence, First Women, and First in Line, all about the inner workings of the White House. So You began as a White House reporter for Bloomberg, and of course, we've been talking. You've written a number of books about life within the White House, those who work and live and serve within the White House. What compelled you to start writing about this topic to begin with?
Well, it was actually one particular day when I was covering Michelle Obama for Bloomberg, and I was at a lunch with her and about a dozen other reporters. Most of us were women because, East Wing reporters still are usually women. Unfortunately, it's still the stereotype there is true. And she was talking to us about her Let's Move campaign, and this server walked in, a White House butler, and she knew him by name. And it was one of those moments where we all got to see at that lunch, there's this sort of Downton Abbey type atmosphere at the White House. And when you're covering the president and the first lady, you're typically working out of the Brady press briefing room. You're sitting in like a cubby in the basement. It's not very glamorous.
Yeah.
And so this was a moment where, you actually got to see this relationship. And I just wanted to explore the people who live and work in the White House who we never get to see. And those are the 100 butlers, maids, carpenters, electricians, florists, you name it. And then I've just always been fascinated by history too. So after that, I wrote about first ladies and then vice presidents and their role throughout history.
Totally. And of course, there is so much to talk about the White House, more than what most of the American public sees on the television every day. As you said, there's so many working components and hundreds, thousands of people that are going in and out of those gates every day that have significant roles, whether it is just to keep the first family comfortable and functioning well, and roles that are changing policies and moving things behind the scenes. So there's tons of material, it seems like.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there's a humanity there too, right? That you can discover what people are really like when you see how they treat the people who work for them, right? So, we all have that friend who's not polite to waiters or,
Totally.
Rude to taxi drivers. And it just tells you a lot about that person. And I think the presidents and first ladies who treat their valet as well and the maids well, I think it says something about who they are and their true character.
Totally. Yeah. And one of the books that I've really dug into and found fascinating, because we know so little often, is about your book, First Women, where you explore the grace and power of America's modern first ladies. And it seems to me, as in your book, you look at the history of these modern first ladies, the role seems to always be kind of evolving. Some first ladies have been greatly involved in activism, justice, policymaking, like Michelle Obama. And then at least the modern perception of Melania Trump is that she might not be quite as involved as some of the other first ladies. Are there any common themes that you discovered or common roles that all first ladies live into, or is it really different based on the presidency?
And that's a great question, because the perils of that position is that there is no blueprint. There's nothing in the Constitution to describe it. There's no job description whatsoever. So each first lady really carves out the role uniquely that best fits them and their family. So each one is so incredibly different. I think that being first lady is just as fascinating as being president, because you can really mold it and shape it into what you want it to be. And like you said, I think Melania Trump in many ways has been a kind of quietly radical first lady. I might even think that some of the things she does are sort of veering towards feminist moves, which I think are, most people would be surprised by. But, the fact that she did not move into the White House for several months, it was unheard of and it has never been done before. She wanted their son Barron to finish school in New York, so she held firm to that. But to your point, she's also not been as effective as Michelle Obama. I mean, this Be Best campaign is really very broad, and she hasn't really done much with it. And I think a lot of that is because she has about half the number of staff Michelle Obama had more than, I believe it was 25. I have the exact number in my book, but and Melania has about a dozen, and many of them don't have a lot of White House experience. So it's really, she's at a detriment. And she also hasn't been able to reach out to other first ladies, with the exception of Laura Bush, for advice. And so usually there's a relationship there, like there was between Michelle Obama and Laura Bush and Hillary Clinton. But because Donald Trump is such a divisive figure, Melania Trump has suffered a bit because of that. So, there's no common theme there in terms of what they can actually concretely get done, but there is this common complaint that all first ladies have, is that they're just under this microscope, but they have very little idea of what's expected of them, and the public seems to just always be looking for points to criticize.
Yeah. Totally. And you talk about this kind of like sisterhood that exists between some of the modern first ladies that transcends political party. And you just kind of highlighted that a bit between Michelle Obama and Laura Bush and Hillary Clinton. First, I kind of just want to see if you have any insights into, is it simply because Donald Trump is such a divisive figure that Melania and Michelle Obama don't have a relationship? Or is there, it seemed like in the beginning, perhaps that Michelle extended an olive branch and tried to engage. Do you have insight into that?
Well, I think a lot of the problem there, I know a lot of the problem there was also because there wasn't anybody for Michelle Obama's staff to even talk to, because Melania Trump had 2 aides at the time. Both of them were based in New York. Both of them have since been fired. So there was nobody for Tina Chen, Michelle Obama's chief of staff, and her close aide to kind of reach out to. And I think that was a big problem. And then, of course, you had the whole speech at the Republican National Convention when Melania Trump plagiarized Michelle Obama's speech. That made for an awkward moment between them. And then, as we saw in Michelle Obama's memoir, she talks about never being able to forgive Donald Trump for what he did with the birther movement. And we all know that Melania Trump also questioned whether or not Barack Obama was born in the United States. So she was kind of part of that. And so there is really no love lost there. I think it's both personal between Michelle Obama and Melania Trump, but also just the logistics of it. There was really, this transition was just not a good one. And there was no one really to talk to in the East Wing during that January period when they could have, like you said, potentially work together a little more.
Totally. Well, and also, I mean, you've also outlined this in the book. First ladies, while there is no written job description, and they do have this pressure of being under a microscope and trying to make the most of the time that they have, it also seems like, at least for some first ladies, this is a really powerful position. The first lady is an unelected role, and yet has the potential to change the direction of the country, whether that's through influencing the president behind the scene, or like some first ladies you talk about, sitting in on cabinet meetings and things like that. Is that a fair read?
I think it's amazing when you actually, and people often, ask, what are some concrete actual things these women have done? And Michelle Obama, of course, simply by being the first African-American first lady, just by being there, did so much. But when she did, for instance, the vegetable garden, that really complemented her husband's healthcare overhaul. It was a great example of a first lady working kind of in tandem with the West Wing, sending a healthy message about eating, and it kind of really complemented what he was doing policy-wise really well. And then going back in history, you have someone like Nancy Reagan, who's probably the best example of a modern first lady who really took charge. I mean, the only other first lady who was as powerful as Nancy Reagan would have been Edith Wilson, because Woodrow Wilson, when he had his stroke, she basically took over and ran the country for several months.
Wow.
Which is an amazing story, but and she wouldn't let certain advisors in to see the president. But then, so you're going back pretty far. But in modern times, Nancy Reagan, she fired her husband's chief of staff because she didn't trust him, and he had hung up on her and was rude to her on the phone.
Wow.
And he never hang up on Nancy Reagan and get away with it. But she also helped end the Cold War. I mean, she in 1985, when Reagan and Gorbachev met, she was very integral during that meeting because she said, she didn't think that her husband and Gorbachev should meet with their advisors and sit across the table and hash out details of this arms agreement. Instead, she thought they should take a walk and just the two men just develop a relationship and talk to each other. And in the end, it was so successful that Reagan said, I don't even need to actually go back to, because of Nancy Reagan, and because she knew that her husband was great in a one-on-one setting. And she knew that what was needed was really this friendship to develop between these two men. And she helped end the Cold War, which is a pretty big deal for any first lady.
Totally. Well, and I'm glad that folks like you are bringing these stories to light because, again, I mean, especially in this moment where around the Clinton campaign, we had this talk of finally breaking a glass ceiling. It actually feels like in some senses, this glass ceiling has been broken for a while. Women actually have, I mean, on one sense, I want to be careful saying that, but in one sense, women have been making significant contributions to the way our country stands in the world. And it's just incredible to hear.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, women, if you look at someone like Eleanor Roosevelt, she was, told by her husband's advisors to stick to her knitting. But instead, and the symbolic importance she had. And so when she, invited Marian Anderson as the opera singer back to the 1940s, and memorial, and she did. And so it was that kind of soft power that I think first ladies, if they're smart, can really use. And another example is Betty Ford. She had breast cancer when she was first lady, and it was a time when nobody uttered the word breast cancer. It's hard to imagine, but people were so ashamed of it. And her husband's advisors told her that they were going to put out a press release saying she was in the hospital for dealing with a woman's health problem, and she refused. She said to Ron Nessen, and who told me, that Betty Ford told him, I absolutely want you to say that I have breast cancer. I'm getting a double mastectomy. I want women to know that this is okay to talk about and that they need to go get mammograms. And she saved, an untold number of lives doing that. So I think that it's that kind of power that these women hold. And I would like to see Melania Trump do more, I think, because she does have this incredible platform.
Totally. Yeah, those are, I mean, again, fascinating stories and incredible stories of how things have been shaped by these powerful women. And we're also kind of standing in Hillary Clinton in her campaign posed the question for, I think, the first time in history that there might be a first man. And now in this 2020 election, you've got people like Pete Buttigieg, who might have his husband holding this position, or someone like Cory Booker, who might be a single president. How would that change if there was a first man, or perhaps there wasn't a partner to the president? How would that change the inner workings of the White House?
That's a great question about Cory Booker, because that, I know he's dating Rosario Dawson, right?
Yes,
I don't
totally.
know if they'll get married, if that was something that might happen. I mean, we've only ever had one bachelor president, and that was James Buchanan. And, he was single, and basically he, because he didn't have a first lady, he relied on, I believe it was his niece, to fill in.
Wow.
But, so you do need somebody there as the spouse, because you need someone. For instance, the Trumps are having a state dinner this week. Who's going to focus on guest lists? menus. I mean, all of that. I would guess if you did have a single president, you would have a very powerful social secretary. And that would be, in tandem, the first lady, her chief of staff, and the social secretary run the White House residence. They make sure everything goes smoothly at social events, and also upstairs on the second and third floors of the White House when they have visitors and what have you, just the running of this house. So I think, I mean, if Cory Booker is elected, he'll have a really powerful social secretary. And I really, really was curious to see, like you said about Hillary Clinton, what a first gentleman would look like. And it would be fascinating to see that. And I think it's almost better that we don't have Bill Clinton as the first gentleman, just because, he's such an iconic figure, and he's a former president, so no one would expect him to really be doing a lot of those ultra feminine things in the first place. One of the most fascinating things would be an Elizabeth Warren or a Kamala Harris, to see their spouses who are, professional men, but, how would they let their wives shine? Would they be content to do that? It seems like they are. One thing in this election that I think is great is that, no one's really talking about what the women candidates are wearing. It's just, totally. It's a nice change of pace, right? That I don't even know what Kamala Harris dresses like, and I think that should be the way forward, I hope.
Totally. Yeah. And I do think hopefully that we have a nice surprise in this next election, and we get to figure out what these new positions look like.
Fingers crossed.
Yes.
For all of us, right? I think we need a change. I think we need to see a man kind of redefine that role so that we can, it's a larger question of how women's roles are viewed in this country, and devalued in a lot of ways. Being a mother, for instance, is something that is the most important role, but I think that people do look down on it to an extent, right? And so I think it would be great to just see how a man changes it. And would we be, for instance, looking at Chasten, what kind of, tuxedo he's wearing at a state dinner or something. Maybe so. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, that will be interesting. And again, I think hopefully a solid move for progress if we can have a woman in a leadership role and a man in a secondary role. It'd be a nice change of pace.
Yes.
And so kind of just switching gears to touch on your newest book, First in Line. You talk about this relationship between the president and the vice president. And honestly, as somebody in the public looking at the vice presidency, it honestly seems like that role doesn't have very much influence in the White House. Is that a correct read on the situation?
I think it's just a jumping off point, especially for someone like Mike Pence. I mean, he's an operator, he is running in 2024. Like, that's what he's doing now, and I think a lot of the one thing you could say about Dick Cheney, and I know a lot of people disagree with the Iraq war, and they're rightfully so, right? There's a lot of mistakes made in that administration, but at least he had no presidential ambitions at that point in his life. And so he wasn't always looking ahead to how things would play out for him. But you have an Al Gore and a Mike Pence who are always gaming it out. How is this going to poll for me? Are they going to use this against me when I run for president? And so I don't know. It would be nice if we had vice presidents sign some kind of oath that they're not going to run for president, because it seems to be like they're just auditioning for a job. And I think that makes it, a role where they're not willing to really, with the exception of Cheney, really in modern times, to really fight back and challenge the president. And you don't see Mike Pence do that a lot. He is really along for the ride, I think. And not to say that he doesn't believe, I mean, he is a Christian and he does believe in I think he has a very strong faith, and I don't think that's an act, but it's that there's a bit of operating going on, and kind of, he's a politician, but very obviously he's kind of manipulating things to hopefully one day be the one sitting in the Oval Office.
Yeah. And I think one of the fascinating things you highlighted is this interesting relationship Joe Biden and Barack Obama actually wrote out as they decided to work together as president and vice president. Can you talk a little bit about this? I think it was like a contract that they signed about what roles they would play with each other.
Yeah, thanks for reminding me about that. I actually forgot about that. That is a really interesting, where they call each other JB and BO. It's like written in shorthand. And Joe Biden wanted to be the last person in the room with Obama when major decisions were made. I mean, and I think thanks for reminding me about Joe Biden, because there's a great example of someone who is currently running for president, and he's kind of facing this difficult position where he's having to, his highlight of his career is being Barack Obama's vice president, but he's also having to answer for decisions made during that administration, and particularly on immigration. But so Biden really wanted to literally be the last person in the room with Obama to kind of challenge him. And I think he did, because he was older too. He was able to, push back. And when I interviewed him for the book, he talked about how he was against more troops in Afghanistan, and he personally had his own son fighting in Afghanistan, and he was very much aware of the toll that this was taking on families, and so he was able to kind of be the counterbalance to the generals in the room who would be pushing for a surge. So he wasn't always effective, but I think he's a good example of a vice president who was able to push back a little bit because he had been in the Senate for so long, and he was older than Obama and had more experience. And so Obama really trusted him.
Totally. And as you kind of talked about, speaking of Joe Biden, so with first ladies, there was this sense of sisterhood between some of them. And apparently there is this relationship between vice presidents. And I was surprised to hear you talk about Joe Biden and Mike Pence having a relationship with each other, quite an active one. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, I don't think they have one anymore.
Oh, okay.
But they did, because I think, Biden told me that he felt like Pence was a lifeline to this administration. Biden would travel, and he does still have all these relationships with foreign heads of state, because he had been in the Senate for almost 4 decades. And so he would contact the White House, and it's really protocol, if you're a former president or a former vice president, you want to explain if you're going somewhere that, is there a message or something that the administration would want Biden to tell a head of state who he meets on a trip. And so he would call Pence, because he felt that Pence was somebody you could deal with. He said they disagree on pretty much everything, but Pence is a career politician who Biden they could speak the same language. And Trump is so different, as we all know from that, that it's just hard for former vice presidents, and certainly former presidents, to kind of maneuver and figure him out.
Yeah, totally. It's just, it was interesting to hear that, though, but also kind of inspiring and hopeful to know that there are at least amicable relationships, even in an era where we are so politically divided and the two administrations could not be further from each other, that Biden was talking to Pence and Pence was talking to Biden. That gave me a little glimmer of hope in the midst of all of this.
Me too. And I think that, there are cases where other administration officials, and I talk about this in a book I have coming out in May, but it's interesting because Trump doesn't talk to former presidents, with the exception of Bush 43, but George W. Bush, but not even that much. But his administration officials, some of them do realize the importance of reaching out and learning from the people who came before them. And I think that is I think what you said is right. It is hopeful. And I think we all want that, some sense of normalcy.
Yeah. And so kind of just to land the plane, talk a little bit about what is your next book? What is it going to be about? What are you covering?
So my next book is about the former presidents. It's called Team of Five, and H.W. Bush is a character in it. And it is about what it is to be a former president. You know, how do you go from being the most powerful person in the world to sort of watching on TV what's going on, and sort of that actual, like, what happens the next day when your plane touches down wherever you're going. And so I think that's really the point of the book, but also in the framework of Trump, you know, looking at how they're responding to Trump. For instance, Trump attacking Obama, saying that he was wiretapped in Trump Tower. I wanted to know, you know, what did President Obama think about that? What did his staff think about that? How do they put together a response? You know, we're just kind of in uncharted territory here. And I wanted to explore that and see if the five former presidents who were living at the time I started writing this book, like, if they spoke to each other, what their relationships are like with each other also.
Totally. It sounds like a fascinating book, and I'm excited to dig into it, just like the other three. And thank you so much for taking some time to chat with me today, and for the work that you do in the world to uplift these stories and help us get a little insight into how our country is run at the highest levels.
Well, thank you. Those were some great questions. I appreciate it.
Yeah.
The Patchwork Podcast is brought to you in part by Melania, a center for spiritual and social renewal, and Mission Gathering San Diego, a progressive, inclusive Christian church.